Imagine being 3 times richer than Jeff Bezos, or wielding so much clout that the U.S. government drafts custom rules to rein in your company. At the height of his power, John D. Rockefeller's personal fortune was estimated at roughly 1.5% of America's entire economy, about $280 billion in today's dollars. The engine of that fortune was Standard Oil. At its peak, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of U.S. refining capacity and a vast web of pipelines, all while demand for kerosene and oil products was exploding. By the way, if you love money, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Now, let's continue. Here's a sobering contrast. In many dynasties, only a sliver of wealth on average, around 10%, survives to the third generation. Yet the Rockefellers remain among the most enduringly wealthy and influential families on Earth. Much of what they did was legal, not all of it was viewed as ethical. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, a man who defined an era long before today's tech and finance titans dominated headlines. John was born in 1839 in Richford, New York, an unremarkable boy in an ordinary setting. No one could have predicted the influence he would one day wield, least of all given the example set by his father, William Avery Rockefeller. William was a hustler with shifting identities, a traveling pitchman who reinvented himself as a doctor, selling homemade remedies of dubious value. He cultivated an image of success, dressed the part, and moved the family often. Rumors swirled about shadier dealings, including a horse-stealing ring. Stability was not his brand. Eventually, in 1857, the family rooted themselves in Cleveland, Ohio. That move changed John's trajectory. Cleveland was a growing city tied to new commercial arteries. It offered chances unknown on the established East Coast. Young John's early years were rural and spare. He attended district school for a few months each year and spent the rest of his time working chopping wood, caring for horses, tending to the farm, raising chickens and turkeys. He was steady, quiet, self-possessed. No one mistook him for a prodigy. What people noticed was his reserve and his habit of doing each task with methodical care. His first job was hardly heroic. He left high school to become an assistant bookkeeper for 50 cents a day. Yet the modest wage hit a steel in tension. He tracked every ledger line, learned cash cycles, studied freight rates, and watched how tiny errors multiplied into real losses. He saved aggressively, said no to small indulgences, and built a reserve. Then he sought a loan from his father, dubious in character, but liquid enough to stake him. With savings and that borrowed stake, he took his first real step into business. In 1859, he co-founded a commodities brokerage, Rockefeller and Clark, trading produce and the new petroleum goods that railways and lamps were beginning to demand. It was shrewd timing. America's oil story was just beginning after the Drake well, and price swings were violent but legible to a disciplined buyer. Cleveland's location compounded the edge. Close to Pennsylvania fields, tied to the lakes and the rail grid, the city could intake crude, refine, warehouse, and ship in multiple directions with minimal deadhead. Rockefeller used that geography like an extra line of credit. He built relationships with grain dealers and shippers, learning which counterparties honored terms under stress. He tested suppliers with small orders, scaled only when reliability proved out, and kept cash buffers so he could buy when panic forced others to sell. Early memos show a style: count everything, distrust luck, prefer predictable pennies to flashy gambles. When lamps shifted from whale oil to kerosene, he already knew who moved barrels cheaply, which bridges iced first, which depots leaked margin through waste or pilferage. Nothing dramatic, just edges accumulating until the edges became advantage, and the advantage a platform for the next leap. He watched credit habits, noting who stretched payables after a bad harvest and who paid early for a tiny discount. Those notes became advantage when he priced risk into terms. He learned bill of lading tricks, how misrouted cars ate 2 days, how insurance clauses shifted when cargo crossed a lake. When panic of 1857-1860 starved weaker traders of cash, he kept buying small lots, earning reputations for certainty that later opened doors. He studied kerosene grades by brightness and smoke, kept samples, and tracked which lamp makers complained least. He recorded evaporation losses in summer and shrinkage on cold sidings in winter, then arranged storage to mute both. By the time the Drake well rewired expectations, Rockefeller had a private map of margins that bankers did not. He still lived plainly, walked to work, and negotiated as if every cent had to report for duty. To outsiders, this looked like stinginess, To him, it was oxygen, the thing that kept the operation breathing when markets turned. The brokerage taught him that success in volatile trades went not to the lucky, but to the liquid, the informed, and the patient. Those lessons would define every later decision, from whom to trust to how hard to press an advantage. He also mapped personalities, who bluffed, who panicked, who kept their word when prices crashed. Those human ledgers mattered as much as any account book, because in thin markets, trust was liquidity. He learned to buy silence with fairness, pay promptly, haggle hard, but not cruelly, leave counterparts intact enough to trade again. That reputation, built cent by cent, became credit he could spend when larger moves demanded cooperation. When others chased, by 1863, Rockefeller and partners had enough capital to open a refinery, and with it came the need for technical judgment. He recruited Samuel Andrews, a practical chemist, who could turn crude variability into repeatable output. Refining then was messy. Flare-offs, foul odors, product that degraded in transit, fires that erased years of profit in an afternoon. Rockefeller's answer was procedure. He insured against catastrophe, standardized tank construction, paid for better stills, and documented every step so improvements compounded. But partnership to him was always provisional. Within 2 years, he bought out his first partner, consolidating control and setting a pattern he would repeat. Reward contribution, remove friction, centralize authority. Capital needs rose with ambition. Stephen Harkness supplied $100,000 on the condition that Rockefeller admit Henry Flagler. The bargain proved catalytic. Flagler designed credit terms sellers could accept in bad years and good. He mapped rail schedules into contracts. He saw how a day saved in transit was a permanent cut to unit cost. Rockefeller matched that with monastic cash discipline. He refused dividend sugar highs in favor of reinvestment, insisting on reserves, redundancy, and training that turned foremen into process engineers. They pruned lines that failed to earn their keep, recycled waste streams into saleable byproducts, and taught workers to treat every spill as a ledger item, not an inevitability. The result was a machine that produced not only kerosene, but enough predictability to negotiate from strength, plan at scale, and stare down volatility without blinking. Andrews translated that philosophy into pipes and pressures. He tweaked condenser lengths, tested acids that stripped impurities, and redesigned still heads to cut fire risk. Where rivals cursed variation, he modeled it, turning ugly feedstock into merchantable output. Rockefeller absorbed each lesson into contracts. Specify tolerances, reward consistency, penalize leaks. When he bought out the early partner, it was not drama, but arithmetic, one brain, one ledger, faster feedback. Flagler added the missing architecture. Credit lines that matched seasonal flows, contracts with clauses for ice delays, and incentives that aligned switchmen, clerks, and foremen with throughput. They built a tiny lab, then a bigger one, and put foremen in the habit of measuring before guessing. Cash journals showed an almost religious avoidance of waste. Scrap turned to paraffin, off-gas sold as fuel, barrels repaired before replaced. Week by week, the refinery became less a workshop and more an instrument. That instrument could be tuned for price wars or for profits, for growth spurts or for drought. It was the prototype of Standard Oil's later operating system, repeatable, scalable, and unafraid of complexity when complexity lowered unit cost. With scale came bargaining power, but they spent it on resilience. They bought better pumps, trained night crews to handle surges, and created checklists for fire drills long before regulators thought to ask. Flagler's contracts cut idle time. Rockefeller's ledgers cut idle capital. Together, they replaced luck with design so that volatility hurt less and opportunity paid more. They preferred boring profits to exciting failures, and boredom scaled. In 1870, at just 31, Rockefeller incorporated Standard Oil, and the strategy snapped into focus. He would not chase drilling luck. He would own the choke point. Refining had steadier costs, clearer learning curves, and the leverage to set standards that upstream and downstream would have to meet. He counted waste like a rival, bought in bulk, and turned byproducts naphtha, lubricants, paraffin into revenue streams that cross-subsidized price cuts. He invested in research and development, hired chemists by the dozen, and built a culture where small process wins were celebrated and banked. Centralization followed. He standardized barrels and gauges, audited valves and gaskets, and codified maintenance so failures became rarities instead of fate. Most competitors still treated operations as craft. Standard treated them as science. He bought sour crude tracks others spurned and paid to solve their sulfur problems, then pocketed the spread when most refiners couldn't match the chemistry. He courted railroads with certainty-guaranteed volumes, tight schedules, fewer accidents, and in return took rebates and drawbacks that cut freight costs to levels rivals could not touch. Each advantage reinforced the next. Cheaper transport financed more capacity. More capacity won better terms. Better terms strangled competitors' cash flow. Rockefeller's creed was simple: dominate the process and the market follows. Optimization was not a flourish, it was the weapon. He learned to think in systems. A refinery was not a building, but a network. Used suppliers, tanks, rail cars, inspectors, contracts, and clocks. Fix a gasket and you save pennies, fix scheduling and you print dollars. He wrote rules that made judgment easier rather than unnecessary, then audited exceptions to improve the rules. He bought cooperatives, built tank cars, and laid pipe when it beat the railroads on cost or certainty. Pricing was a weapon, but not the only one. Reliability was a quieter blade. Customers learned that Standard's barrels arrived when promised and burned clean, so merchants favored Standard even when prices matched. Meanwhile, Rockefeller nurtured a habit of absorbing adjacent margins: packaging, storage, freight insurance, even lamp maker credit. Every adjacency captured was one fewer leak in the bucket. Competitors tried to copy the price, but not the discipline, and copying price without structure only accelerated their ruin. From this compounding came the perception of inevitability, the sense that Standard would win the next skirmish because it had won the last 10. That aura, too, was an asset, lowering borrowing costs and raising bargaining power long before a contract was signed. Even so, Rockefeller understood that dominance invited scrutiny. He cultivated a low public profile, refused theatrical boasts, and let punctuality do the talking. The method was not romance, it was repetition. Every day the same: measure, tighten, renegotiate, reinvest. And with each turn of that wheel, the gap widened until the market mistook discipline for destiny. The pieces labs, contracts, freight, byproducts clicked into a plan. So he invested in research and development and built a culture of relentless process improvement. He centralized labor, standardized operations, and hunted profit in byproducts others ignored. He bought fields others dismissed, like Ohio sites yielding sour crude that most refiners considered useless. Rockefeller's scientists engineered ways to scrub impurities, turning throwaways into revenue. Again and again, he found value where others saw loss. That philosophy solved the bottleneck. Own the margin became a signature. But optimization alone didn't explain Standard Oil's ascendancy. Rockefeller pursued dominance. In the first 3 months of 1872, he bought, shuttered, or bankrupted 22 of Cleveland's 26 refiners. He approached struggling owners with fair prices, but those refineries were floundering partly because Standard Oil's scale and tactics had already squeezed them. With massive output and meticulous logistics, Rockefeller extracted rebates from railroads by guaranteeing huge daily shipments deals that cut his transport costs to levels competitors couldn't match. He also backed the Southern Improvement Company, an overt attempt to lock in favorable rates and crush rivals outright. Public fury killed that scheme, a reminder that even the most powerful mogul could not simply bulldoze a united public. Standard Oil became a national symbol, often caricatured as an octopus with tentacles around oil, railroads, steel, state houses, and even Washington. Rockefeller shunned the press, which only stoked investigative zeal. By the late 1880s, his control of refining hovered around 90%. The backlash grew. Politicians under electoral pressure moved against rebates and monopolistic practices, and journalists exposed Standard's inner workings to a nation increasingly suspicious of concentrated power. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered the trust dissolved into 34 separate companies. Rockefeller, then 56, withdrew from day-to-day management, remaining a symbolic head but shedding operational burdens. Ironically, the breakup turned out to be lucrative, as the pieces prospered and his holdings appreciated. It also may have extended his life. The strain of running a sprawling, embattled empire had taken a toll. Journalist Ida Tarbell, whose work helped ignite the antitrust case, described him as a wan, hairless figure, an image that, to many, mirrored the moral costs of his methods. Was ill health the price of ruthless ambition? It's speculative, but the timing is suggestive. Around this period, his focus pivoted from control to contribution. In 1913, he and his family established the Rockefeller Foundation, channeling a vast endowment toward public health, education, and science. He had already founded the University of Chicago and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, both destined to become pillars of scholarship and biomedical discovery. His philanthropy funded advances against meningitis and yellow fever, seeded modern medical education, and created schools of public health at Johns Hopkins and Harvard. He backed sanitation campaigns across the rural South and public health work abroad, attacking hookworm, malaria, and typhus. Strategically, Rockefeller preferred large, systemic bets over scattered donations. The foundation's support for agricultural research helped catalyze the Green Revolution, which dramatically raised crop yields in the developing world and, by some estimates, saved vast numbers of lives. For years, the foundation's foreign grants rivaled or exceeded U.S. government aid. By 1912, his fortune approached $900 million in contemporary dollars. Yet, at his death, his estate was a small fraction of that, reflecting a lifetime of giving. Motivations are complex. Tax advantages, reputation, legacy, and genuine belief in progress all likely played roles. Whatever the mix, the impact was, and remains, real. The Rockefeller presence did not fade with Standard Oil's breakup. Many of today's energy giants, Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, BP, via mergers trace lineage to those 34 baby standards. The family itself continued producing millionaires and billionaires. David Rockefeller, who died in 2017 at 101, was at one point the world's oldest billionaire. In 2016, the family signaled a values shift by fully divesting from fossil fuels, citing ethical reasons, even as their fortune had been built on oil. How did their wealth endure when so many dynasties dissolve? Structure. The Rockefellers professionalized the family office, centralizing investment, legal, tax, and administrative functions under one roof. They pioneered irrevocable trusts to shield assets from capricious heirs, taxes, and creditors. They used conservative leverage and long-horizon allocation, along with insurance-based strategies sometimes described by advisors as cascade or waterfall approaches. Assets compounding inside tax-advantage wrappers, ownership passing in carefully sequenced steps across generations. The details are private, but the broad idea is simple. Reduce leakage, extend time frames, and keep governance tight. Influence endured as well. From the mid-20th century onward, Rockefellers occupied high office or sat close to it. Networks built through philanthropy, finance, and public service created soft power that outlasted any one company. The Rockefeller Foundation, like other mega-foundations, became a player in global health, agriculture, and development partnerships. Admirers credit it with pragmatic, science-driven progress. Critics argue that such private influence can skew priorities, marginalize public institutions, and favor market-centric solutions. Both can be true. Philanthropy can fill gaps and still reflect the worldview of those who fund it. The Rockefeller story resists simple moral sorting. Rockefeller mastered the game as it existed and worked to reshape it when the rules no longer served his aims. He built a monopoly, then a philanthropic apparatus that advanced medicine, education, and public health. He extracted advantage aggressively, then gave with strategic breadth. The ledger shows both harm and help, coercion and cure. That tension is the point. Modern capitalism contains the same duality. It produces scale efficiencies that lower costs and raise living standards while concentrating power in ways that society must periodically confront. So, what should we take from his example? First, cost discipline and process innovation remain underrated moats. Second, control of chokepoints logistics, distribution, standards can be more decisive than flashy upstream bets. Third, public sentiment and political risk are as real as supply and demand. Ignore them, and you will be forced to reckon with them later, and on worse terms. Fourth, if you build something that changes the world will change you back through law, reputation, and the need to balance profit with legitimacy. A century after Rockefeller's rise, the names have changed, but the patterns feel familiar. Platform monopolies, regulatory showdowns, antitrust debates, philanthropic megaprojects, echoes everywhere. The question is not whether power accumulates. It always does. The question is how we channel it and how we judge those who try. If you made it this far, drop a plus in the comments your badge for finishing the deep dive. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more long-form stories where money, history, and power collide. Curious about earlier empires of capital? Check out our others video.